Hello, everybody. I'm Grandmaster Joel Benjamin. Welcome to ICC's recap of the Tata Steel Masters tournament in Vacanze in the Netherlands. And this is our second recap, which will cover rounds 5 through 9. And it's been a pretty interesting tournament. A lot of good games and a lot of action happen these rounds. So a lot to bring to you. But today we're going to start off with Magnus Carlsen again, and he's had action in every round. He really hasn't had. He's only had one or two boring draws. But as this group of games start around 5, he was playing the tail ender Niels Grandelius. So he was looking for a win in this game, and he plays the Sicilian. So when he says, okay, draw's good, e4, e5, he's pretty unbeatable. But he goes for the Taimanov, which was my old favorite defense in the Sicilian. But I gave it up. Why? I gave it up because people figured out that they could castle queenside against it. I didn't like that so much. Well, Grandelius plays g4, which is suddenly a hot new move, kind of a riff on the standard English attack with f3 and queen d2. And they actually are following a game for a while. Queen d2 could back up to protect c2. And this position actually occurred in a game of Carlsen's countryman Tari, who was playing white, and bishop d6, I think, was played in that game. So I don't know if that led to any discussions, but Magnus plays h6. It looks like kind of a funky move to be, pushing a pawn on the king side like that, but it sort of forces white to make a decision with that pawn, and if he takes on f6, that allows a knight to come out. So black actually, I guess, has a nice centralized pawn structure, but he's got to put the king somewhere, a3, and now, it gets pretty interesting with bishop a3, a temporary sacrifice. So if white moves the bishop, then black can take the knight, queen takes d7, king f8. All right, the bishop is hanging, but white has stuff hanging too, so nothing special happens. Probably it's equal. So Grandelius has this sack back, knight b5, and that allows the bishop to retreat. And now Magnus probably gets a little excited with this d5. Objectively, he should have just played knight f7. And if bishop takes b5, he can just simply play bishop c6. He actually has this nice centralized pawn structure, and eventually he's going to get some nice play on the c file. But d5, I suppose, is a tempting move, although objectively, it's probably not good. According to the engines, check and queen b3 to defend, and that gives white the better game. I guess he's getting ready to take on d5. So Grandelius passed on that. He defended with the bishop, but now after d4, black starts to get the advantage. And now precarious situation for white that he's forced to repeat. And Magnus looks over the situation, decides first to pump the rook in, and now the bishop comes to e2. Queen b7, well, mate threat, but that just leads to another repetition. So Magnus looks around, and he plays bishop b5. Again, it's a very tough position to play over the board. The engines say bishop c4 was a better move just to control that diagonal. Rook h to b3 was also possible here. It seems that black may have some advantage. But after the move bishop b5, he's trying to get the bishop to c4 with tempo, but Grandelius finds this nice Zwischenzug, threatening rook g7 and take the queen. And after black defends, now the queen comes over, again threatens queen g7. And after queen b6, white trades queens. And now the game just sort of peters out. Bishops of opposite colors, lots of weak pawns, but the thing is that, just a lot of trades happen. And Magnus tries to hold on to those pawns in the center, but he's not able to. The rook has to hold on to the bishop, and then the e-pawn drops. And then eventually they get down to pretty much nothing, and they agree to a draw. So a little bit of a missed opportunity for Carlsen. He wasn't winning exactly, but he certainly would have wanted to win that game and make a move. But the rest of this period was kinder to him. Now, just to recap round 5, there were some decisive games. Richard Rapport beat Pragnananda in a sharp Nimzo Indian. So that was kind of a high point of the tournament for him. And Van Foreest was a little bit overly provocative in his play against Mamedyarov. Mamedyarov scored a win. Remember, in the first group of games, he had a bit of good fortune against Duda. So we see Mamedyarov starting to parlay that into a good tournament position. We'll see more of that later in the show. All right, so we move on to round 6. Oh, I'm sorry. I have one more game to report from round 5. And this is one that could go under the radar a little bit, Duda against Karyakin, because the reason why I want to show this game to you is the final position. So first of all, Karyakin goes for a very sharp variation. And here, knight d5 and b3 are the main lines with great complications. Duda plays bishop e2. This is a rare move. I found it in one game, and perhaps Duda also saw that and decided he wanted to try it. Knight h3. Well, the knight, his idea, I guess, is that he wants to bring that knight to f4 to battle against the d5 square to break down that blockade. But probably he should have played bishop to f3 now and get on it right away. This actually gave Black a little bit of time to defend the center. And Karyakin gets his kingside developed and is able to defend everything. So Duda puts these pawns forward, but he's got a protected pass pawn, but he's really kind of stopped there. And Black with the extra pawns on the queen side is probably better, although a lot of play in the position. G6 really gets it very complicated. It's certainly a controversial whether Black should try to fight white on the king side, but that's what Karyakin did. He's trying to play there in order to soften up the queen side, and ultimately he does that as Duda tries to attack on the king side. Now the pawn comes forward. So Karyakin is making his move, brings his queen in. And now we have this repetition. Knight e7. Black has to worry a little bit about being able to defend against queen h4. Rook c1, rook g4. This is actually a big mistake. But the game ended like this, bishop e3 and repetition, right? But in this position, Duda could have played rook f1. Okay, defending the queen. So the rook is attacked. Rook goes back to g8, and queen h4 is very powerful. So he rejected it, I'm sure, because of rook e4, queen g2, knight g6. All right, Nate was threatened on g7, so he had to. Pawn takes, rook takes e2. At first, this looks like Black is winning. Not so, says the computer. e7, that's the star move. Well, okay, so let's say Black takes. But first, let's look at the side variation, queen c4, so that if white queens, the rook can take, no longer pin. Well, in this case, white just takes on h7. And he's going to mate with this queen. It's not surprising that white mates, but it's kind of nice to look at how he does it. King takes h6, rook f6. So king here, check, trying to bring the rook in, rook g8, boom. I like that. King takes, queen check. So king h8, queen h5, followed by rook f7. Goes up. That's a nice little king hunt, right? Okay. So go back to this position, queen g2, and g6, takes, rook takes, e7. So when you say bishop takes e7, well, the whole point is that white lured that bishop off of the diagonal. So now not only white can occupy the diagonal, but he's just taken away the threat of rook h2. And after queen g3, white is threatening to come in here, he's threatening to come in here, and that's going to be decisive. He's just going to get to the white king first. The black king first, I should say. Pardon me, I meant to say g7 check first, king g8, queen g3. All right. So actually, I'll just back that up. There's also queen takes, but this one is a little bit more prosaic, g7 check, and rook takes f6, with a huge threat of rook f8 mate. And okay, black can trade queens. The best black can do is trade queens and play rook over and take the pawn on g7, play down the exchange, but that's a winning endgame for white. So rook f1 was a winning move, but I mean, it's very hard to see that move e7. You know, if you got a computer running, that's great, and Duda did not. So that was a big opportunity for him to get back into the tournament. All right, so now we move on to round 6, and Magnus. Okay, and here he wins. In my book, World Champion Chess for Junior, I referred to Magnus as the master of everything and nothing, because he does everything well, and nothing because he wins by nothing, by seemingly having nothing, doing nothing, or having nothing. And in this game, black is fine pretty much until the end, almost the end of the game, and then he's lost. Knight c6. So it's a Catalan. Report plays a sharper line than the main line of bishop e7 and castling. Bishop e3. All right, I checked on ChessBase. This is the 7th most common move in the position, and that seems to be a hallmark of Magnus, is that he's very good at finding these moves that are not the most popular moves in the position, and therefore the opponent is not necessarily hugely booked up. Now, what black should do exactly, I'm not sure, but after bishop d6, we're down to one game in the database where white played knight fd2, and that certainly looks like a logical move to take the pawn back. But Magnus goes for queen c1, and so black gains a tempo to bring out his bishop at the cost of weakening his pawn structure. So white has a little bit of an edge in the pawn structure, that black has one extra pawn island. But, you know, in itself, that shouldn't be such a big deal. And Report is looking to play c5 and liquidate that weakness. I'm sure that there are other ways to play it as well. So Magnus goes in and grabs this pawn. And, you know, that is not necessarily such a big deal. Bishop d5, I think, is a pretty good move, setting up, threatening to trap the queen, setting up some tactics there. There's certainly a lot of potential for getting the a pawn back. It's a position that black should equalize without any problem. Bishop takes f3. This move was also acceptable. Magnus took back with the bishop to keep covering that a8 square. And now queen takes d4, bishop e5, skewer, right? So that's out. Magnus plays a4, plays rook a2 first, getting the rook off of that diagonal. Report could play e5 here, defend the pawn. Or perhaps strongest would be knight e5. And if queen takes d4, I think black can actually play bishop takes a3, hitting this rook, and this also a counterattack on this knight on d2. So black is on the verge of equalizing. He plays queen e7. This is, well, this is a little bit passive. I guess it's obvious movement that attacks the a pawn. The a pawn comes forward. Now black probably has to play pawn to e5 to defend the pawn. But Report played rook d8. I'm not sure what he missed because now Carlsen just simply took off the pawn. Black doesn't really have compensation. And his play from here just made things worse. Just got some pieces out of position, and now the a pawn comes forward, supported by the bishop on the long diagonal, and black just got himself into a lot of nasty pins. Defends the rook, so he tries for some tactics, but Magnus has more tactics. b7, and white not only has two pieces of a rook, but the b pawn is going to cost black more material. So just a very strange loss for a Report who was fine the whole game, and then suddenly the game was over. You know, that's that can happen to you against Magnus. Elsewhere in the round, Karyakin beat Van Forest. Nice squeeze in a King's Indian. Finally, Karyakin getting back into it. I think bringing himself to 50% there. But a really key game in the round was Caruana Giri. Caruana trying to get going. I think he had all draws up to this point, and he decides to kind of change his tactics with or strategy, if you will. We tend to use them interchangeably, don't we? He plays a King's Indian attack against Giri, just thinking like, well, I'm trying to squeeze out advantages in these theoretical positions. I'm just going to play with all the pieces on the board. And this London system Giri plays is well known to be very, very solid, not really offering white anything. But as I said, Fabi just plays with all the pieces on the board. Rook AC1. This actually move I don't understand at all. I don't know what the rook does there. I think it's maybe better on A1, but I don't want to judge someone who knows a lot more about chess than I do. Bishop C5, and now E5. And soon we have E5. So Fabi is going to go for his counterplay on the king side. The rook has to return. F4. Now queen D7. Probably he should have played knight C5. Try to trade off that knight because that knight's ready to come to D4, maybe sooner than later. Queen D7. And now Fabi introduces some nice play with F5 and Queen F3. So now he's getting ready to bring this knight to D4 and take that pawn on F5. Anish counters that with knight C5, so he's ready to take the pawn on A4. Trade. Bishop H3 is interesting right away because if takes, queen takes, and then white can follow up with E6, and he can actually get some nice initiative even down a pawn. But perhaps that's not stronger than what Fabi did. He played D4, making sure he can keep his knight. And even though it blocked his bishop, after bishop H3, G6, G4, he gets a lot of nice play in the king side. So F4 happened, G5, Queen A7. And this is a hugely critical moment as Caruana goes wrong with bishop takes rook, which just enables black to have a very nice exchange sacrifice. What he should have done is knight G4, and it's not really that obvious, but after bishop takes G5, bishop C1, black is just not coordinated to defend the king side. White just has more units over here. You see all the black pieces on the queen side. White just threatening bishop F4, removing that defender. And if H5, knight F6 check, looking to get rid of that bishop, very hard for black to defend the king side. So that was a very key moment in the game. Knight G4, he would have been in good shape to win the game. But both sides started to get very low on time, and the game concluded in a time scramble. What didn't exactly conclude, they went past the time control. So bishop takes g5, defending f7, and bishop d7, fancy move, but black just tucks the king in the corner and has monstrous compensation for the exchange. Okay, so the engines say knight d2 or rook e8 were stronger. This is, I guess, kind of a safe move. Maybe gives back a little bit of the advantage. And now we're headed towards the end of the time scramble. Black should probably take on f5 and play rook e8 now with advantage. Rook e8, this allowed white to play queen h5, hitting the rook. The rook doesn't really have any place to go. And so white maybe has gotten to the point of equalizing things. But instead, a howler, rook b6, and then it got taken. So one might say at this point that that Fabi maybe needs advice from the Botez sisters on how the knight moves, because it seems that for a moment he forgot. I can't explain it any other way. I don't know. I can't see any logical reason to play rook b6, giving the exchange back without really getting anything. And Anish was able to convert from this position. He could trade queens, but he decided to get rid of the bishops. And this is good enough. King g7 just sets up for a killing check on the f file with the rook. Queen f2 mate is threatened, so the queen has to keep checking. And he runs out of checks. Rook f4 coming, Fabi resigns. So that, basically dealt a death blow to Fabi's chances of winning the tournament. So really a hard luck for him there. And now we move on to round 7. And before we look at any games, the big news of round 7 was a forfeit. Daniil Dubov forfeiting to Anish Giri. How did that happen? Well, it was deemed that a close contact of Dubov had tested positive for COVID. And so he had to get tested. He took the rapid antigen test, he passed it, negative, took the PCR test, but the rule was that while awaiting the results of the PCR test, he would have to play with a mask, and his opponent would play with a mask as well. He refused. I think Dubov claimed that he had said beforehand that he wasn't going to wear a mask for any games. His freedom, right? I don't know if what was specified in the contracts of the players. I think that they should have made all the players sign off to any kind of COVID regulations right in their contract, and if anyone refused, they should have replaced them. So this is kind of a black mark to have a player forfeit. Dubov subsequently, the PCR test came back negative, and he continued on in the tournament after this forfeit. But I understand in this game, Carlsen and Praggnanandhaa, that these players played with the mask for this game. So it's like it's okay for everyone else, but somehow Dubov, I don't know. I guess he follows the lead of Novak Djokovic and Aaron Rodgers as his favorite sportsman, and so no points for him in this round. Okay, so Praggnanandhaa Carlsen. Well, we know that this is a game that Carlsen wants to win, even with black. He wants to win every game, but probably his two biggest targets back-to-back in Grandelius, Praggnanandhaa. So he plays a Queen's Gambit accepted. And Praggnanandhaa plays somewhat originally, although I'm always disappointed to find that these very original looking ideas are not that original. There's actually 4 games with this move d5 it's a double-edged move, and good for Pragnananda that it seems that he's come out that he wants to win this game. And it's a double-edged position. I mean, all I could say is chances for both sides. It's hard to say more than that. B4 certainly is a natural-looking move. He didn't play it. One interesting possibility is after bishop b7, he could just defend the rook with the knight and sacrifice the exchange, and gets a lot of play there. But Carlsen did not play b4. He kept his pawns steady for the moment. Patient play. And this turns out to be a big mistake. He could have played e5, more aggressive move. But now suddenly white position doesn't coordinate. Queen f4. Important that he's able to play this with tempo on the queen. And now queen e6. Queen c6 might have been better because white could have played knight takes c5. Bishop takes c5. He can just take on c5 because the rook hangs on b8. And it's not good for white, but it's maybe less bad than the game. Instead, he gives up this pawn. So rook a8, so the rook is not hanging, and kind of strange how he sacks the pawn, but he's just, I guess, trying to keep the black pieces tied down. This knight on d7, black, it needs defending, but black is able to do that. And now he's getting ready to move the knight. c4. I think apparently bishop b7 was better. If rook takes knight, queen takes knight, knight h6 check, rook takes, queen takes, and now Mr. Engine says bishop takes rook, startling move, and then followed by bishop takes b3, and black gets massive compensation for the exchange. But that's not really a very human continuation. So c4 made more sense. But now white maybe could have tried bishop takes g7 and rook d6, followed by queen h6, with at least some practical chances there. But queen d4 led to complications that were very favorable for black. Knight f6, he tried knight b6, and now c3. This turns out to be a crushing blow, as at the end of all these trades, the pawn becomes a monster on b2, and it's really unstoppable. Knight c3 is coming. Knight d4 would not help. Rook d2, and now rook c. This only increases the threats, and the b pawn gets through. So after that little skirmish of complications, Magnus emerges with the win. There were a couple of other decisive games. Van Foreest, who you have to enjoy his play in the tournament. He's had a lot of decisive games. He beat Giri in an IMSO Indian, and which turned out to be sorry, he did not beat Giri in that game, but he did win. I wrote that wrong. He beat Vidit in that game. That was actually an important game for the standings. And Caruana got one back, beating Duda with black. Good for him. But the game I want to look at is Grandelius Karyakin. This is a draw, and another game that could go under the radar. But I got to show you what they get to in the final position, because this is one of the weirdest positions that I've ever seen. It's the Petrovs, and it doesn't look all that exciting. Queen d3 is a rare move. Queen usually goes to d2. So they get this endgame or middle game without queens. Karyakin has two bishops. He's just keeping the position. And knight h7, this is a very bold grab, maybe not such a good idea. We used to, like bishops taking rook pawns and getting trapped by the knight pawn, like the Fisher trap. And here we see like another version of it, where the knight gets trapped in by this pawn in f6. So bishop g6 protects, but now there are two white pieces that are stranded and can't move. But the other side of the coin is that black doesn't have an easy time moving either. So he has to do this to get that bishop out. But now a very weird kind of blockade emerges. So black has these triple pawns. And now apparently if black would move this bishop outside of the chain, bishop h3 or bishop g4, he would be winning because he would be able to eventually use these pieces maybe to get this bishop around to oppose the white bishop and win the knight. But instead after rook d8, now we have a strange positional draw, as black is just unable to make progress. Actually, white probably could even play g5, but he decides to just move the rook back and forth. He does not want to take that pawn on c4. You'll see why in a moment. So eventually they trade the rooks. And now look at this position. We have a strange positional draw because his bishop on a6 is boxed in by this row of black pawns. It can come back to c8 and d7, but it can't get out. So we've got four minor pieces, and really only one of them can move anywhere, but it can't attack anything. So this is a really bizarre final position, a minor piece ending where all the minor pieces are stuck, and it's a draw. I've really never seen anything like that. So that was a very odd game. All right, so let's move on to round 8. And we have a lot of decisive games in this round that really affected the race for first place. Let me just mention the other games. Caruana Van Foreest. Van Foreest resurrected the Dilworth attack, which is a sacrifice of two pieces for a rook in the Open Spanish. And I don't know if Fabi remembered the theory or anything, but that game ended in a draw. And there was also Carlsen playing against Shankland. Carlsen playing, I believe it's called the von Henning Schauer Gambit. It's something from the Tarish defense, and sacrificing a pawn. Shankland gave it back. I don't know, maybe it was a slightly dubious position for Carlsen at first, but ended up petering out into a draw. So now Mamedyarov Praggnanandhaa, that's, let's say that one 3 times fast, right? So again, the kid can expect that everybody wants to take advantage of him. So Mamedyarov out for bear in this game. And these lines with c6 either here or with knight f6 and c6 on the third move, very popular these days, a very great challenge. d4 and e4, and I guess this is a move that has become popular. Black used to take on d4, play bishop b4 check, but this leads to a very double-edged position. And then Mamedyarov, queen a4, it's a known move. Has been played a few times, and there was one notable game, I believe it was Svidler-Geary. Black played bishop d7, which actually makes a lot of sense. I think that Svidler played d6 there, which doesn't look all that impressive, and I don't think he got any advantage. But b5 is principled, and I think that both players kind of following the engines here for a while. Which is, hard to believe sometimes in these creative positions. Knight takes d5, bishop h3. Now, where does Praggnanandhaa go wrong? Maybe here. Maybe knight d7 is a better move because this brings out the knight. And now white starts to get some initiative because he's able to break down the center. if black were able to maintain the center, he'd have a very nice position, but now white starts to break through and push back black pieces. And now he's really started developing initiative, so Pragnananda tries to force the queens off. The white just has an excellent position. He could play knight d3, harass the queenside pawns. He goes knight f5, g6. Again, great options. h6 pawn could be grabbed, or rook c1. He just decides to directly win this queenside pawn. Say, okay, win that queenside pawn, come back for the f3 pawn. I guess kind of plays in a relatively simple manner. If one little tactic here, rook d8 takes, and suddenly the rook comes over for big check, and we have a pin. And it's not actually a liquidation into pawn ending. It just wins the piece. Rook takes d4, knight takes f6, and white should win with that extra knight. I wish it were a liquidation into the pawn ending. I do love those. But he does get this f3 pawn, and Pragnananda tries to wiggle a bit. So he breaches these pawns. And now if king e6 to defend, white also defends. And if white defends everything, it's going to be a trivial win. He can't take the knight because of b3 check. And that is the liquidation to the pawn ending, and it wins for white. So he took the pawn, but white just took more pawns. Probably knight b5 was a little sturdier, but the h pawn is going to run in any case. And white just makes sure the pawns don't queen. He's got too many pawns on the other side, and that's that. So big win for Mamedyarov, which gives him a share of the lead with 5.5 points, tied with Magnus Carlsen. All right, now Vidit against Grandelius. This was a pretty interesting game. Now, I said that that Vidit was more of a kind of a steady player than some of these other guys like Rapport and Van Foreest. So he does something maybe a little bit unusual, but Grandelius, I don't know, he can't satisfy himself with a simple d6. He wants to, kind of sharpen it up. Well, there is a point that maybe black will want to play d5, but he provokes his pawn forward, and then he provokes more with knight h5. And now all these moves. And I thought, wow, nice creativity by Vidit. But actually, this has all been played 4 times before as well. So sometimes it's hard to find anything new. If pawn takes, no one has tried this. This seems to lead to a big initiative for white, with the black king very exposed. It looks quite dangerous. So he went as everyone else has played c5. And now white defends the pawn on g4. Black breaks down the center a little bit. Bishop h6, I think this is a new move, pinning the knight. Now we go into an ending. That may not be a good move because white is really strong on the king's side, and it probably wasn't a great idea for black to do that. And now, I think in this position, okay, he plays knight e6. That does not turn out well. But black has this bizarre move, bishop f5. And if takes, knight takes, the bishop is trapped. He gets that back. But if you take on g7, bishop b4 with a tempo on the rook. So the bishop f5 gives black a better position than he gets in the game. In the game, he's in a lot of trouble. The knight switches over to the other side, but now the king's side is vulnerable. f5 happens, takes. Now Vidit has a very good alternative with g5. If takes, and white gets the rook on the g file, the bishop can come to f3. A lot of pieces point down a relatively undefended king, cause some problems there. But Vidit went for rook f1, and now probably black should bite the bullet and go for this. It looks extremely dangerous, but it might be, might be playable. One possible line is takes. Also, bishop f3 can be played. Rook f3. So the idea is rook g1, bishop g7, and a discovered check. But I think that black, I may be playing these moves in the wrong order, but we get to this position, and black is still in the game. So the problem is that Grandelius, he never played any challenging moves, and now he just kind of gets a rough position without any compensation. And maybe the last chance to make waves is bishop takes f5. Again, a bishop sacrifice on the square. And maybe black has better chance to hold this position. And now Vidit, he consolidates everything. He slow plays at a4, really kind of accentuating black's misery here. Maybe knight b5 will come, so he defends that. It just defends everything, improves, maybe a little bit of threat of the king coming in. And now he hits with c4. If takes, knight takes c6. Now rook takes d2 would not be with check. King a3, right? So white would have knight takes e5 and bishop takes d2 and a piece ahead. But if pawn takes, rook takes, knight takes, bishop takes. If king e7, maybe the simplest is bishop d2, bishop d5 rather, and take the pawn. And not only pawn ahead, but two bishops against two knights. Black pieces are in great danger. So you basically, black just went down without any fight. White took a pawn, and this move does not actually pin the pawn. So you have to d-take c6, Grandelius resigned. So big win for Vidit, propelling him to 5 points. But perhaps the most interesting game of the round might have been Esipenko Giri, a game with possible theoretical implications. So we have a gioco piano, or Italian game, and d5. So this is a very sharp variation. Black fighting for the initiative. And as it always is, this is a position that has occurred a few times. Now, rook a d8 is the most common move. This is an offshoot. There are some games. It provokes white into grabbing a piece with g4. And knight e5, not the only move in the position, but interesting. Here, there was one game between two not famous players where white played knight b3, and this is perhaps a critical move. Black could trade queens and take the f pawn, but perhaps the idea would be queen d5 check, because the white takes is rook takes e1 Zwischenzug. So f3, and we might have takes bishop d6. And although black does not get the f pawn right away, queens on the board, it's a tricky position to navigate. So I don't want to say that knight b3 was just a stronger move. I'm sure that Giri was prepared for it. But we just didn't get to see what he would do. So I think Esipenko just went for a safer move. And now we have an unbalanced but balanced position, 3 pawns for a piece. And you don't often see just 3 pawns for a piece where the position is just kind of leveled off and we're just in for a long game. And I think that in general, white really wants to keep some pieces on the board. Maybe knight g4 would be a move here. What happened was there was a lot of liquidation. And as things got traded, I think that just sort of played into black's hands. I don't know if that was a misevaluation of the position by Esipenko, but the position gets more favorable for black. Okay, rook takes pawn, rook e2. So now the pawns start to come forward. This is a very interesting moment because now it seems that black is a bit maxed out. He can play g3, but then white will take it, and that probably the rook ending probably isn't winnable. Again, black's piece is a little bit tied down. So we have, it appears to me, a kind of Zugzwang situation, because if either of the white rooks moves off the f file, black is able to push that pawn to f5, and then they're really coming forward. But he's just kind of stuck for a move. He doesn't want to move the knight and allow g3, so he plays b4, and basically at the end of these pawn moves, he finally moves the rook. But now rook e5, the f pawn coming forward, knight d2. This is a huge blunder. Black has the edge, but now black is winning. And it's just that I think that Esipenko just underestimated his g3, which looks a little counterintuitive because it gives up the f3 square for the knight to check on. But in fact, knight f3 check runs into king f4. Now, what else for white to do? Rook can't move, rook e2. So he has to go knight f3. But I think that he missed that this would get taken with check, and then the knight goes, and it's a losing rook ending. So rook f1, and now very nice shot, h3 check. I think he needs this to be winning. But now if king g1, g2, another shot, just giving white no time to get organized. And after rook f2, the nicest move is king g3. And now white has to play rook g2 and take on e5, but it's a lost rook ending again. So he took the pawn, but now basically he's getting mated, g2, rook f2, and then there are more than one ways to win the position, but king e3 is a very nice move, and that's the end. I think the cutest line is rook takes g2 is answered by king takes f3, and if rook takes g7, rook h5 with mate on the side. So nice game for Giri. Fortune favors the brave. He took a chance with that piece sacrifice, unclear consequences, and gradually the ending got better for him. Those pawns were like space invaders, and they came forward and won the game. So after 8 rounds, we see Carlsen Mamedyarov tied for first, 5.5, half a point ahead of Giri and Vidit. And so we see that those decisive games had a real big impact on the leaderboard, but still several more rounds to go. I want to just mention something that I really haven't gotten to at all because there's so much to cover. The B group, I think they call it the challengers. Once upon a time there were 3, but there's cutbacks. Maybe that was when COVID came. The B group, the young Indian Grandmaster Arjun, I think he's 19 years old, is leading with 7 out of 8. Very impressive score. And so he seems to be a player to keep your eye on, and I am expecting that he will be in the top group in 2023. So that's the story from Vikensee. So far, I'm Grandmaster Joel Benjamin. Thanks for joining me, and we will have a couple of more of these ICC recaps on the Tata Steel Masters tournament through the conclusion of the event, and I hope that you'll be with me for those. Bye-bye.